With the surprising
30,000 views!
and overwhelming success of my first video, I knew I had to take my research to the next level, so I headed to the prestigious University of Louisville campus where I'd seek the maximum knowledge for the minimum requirements for City Skylines 2. But the library is closed on Sundays, so I headed to the next best place and traded in my library card for a frequent shopper's card. It was there that I found it. It's a tale of two City Skylines, and your minimum education starts now. It's 2003 and my less than 5-year-old computer can barely handle SimCity 4's new 3D graphics. Luckily, I can turn the settings on low and turn off things like waves in the ocean, and this game runs like a dream. Fast forward to insert date you're watching and City Skylines 2 is preparing for takeoff. On my previous video, we talked about the recommended requirements for the game. Today, we're going to talk about the minimum requirements and see if your computer can defend the honor of my Pentium 2. The first thing I wanted to educate myself on was the difference between these minimum and recommended requirements. First, let's take a look at the CPU processors. Not surprisingly, the recommended CPUs are faster than the minimum, although not by much. If you're looking at these speeds and wondering why there's a difference, even though they have very similar numbers, it's because of something called IPC, or instructions per clock. Even though these processors are doing these instructions at the same speed, newer processors are better at delivering more data at once. Regardless of that data, your processor's catch speed can determine just how fast those instructions are received. Older processors with smaller catch speeds can struggle with IPC, and as a result, your graphics card has to wait on the CPU, an issue known as bottlenecking. What's all this mean for City Skylines 2 and trying to get by with the minimum? It could mean that an older processor may struggle in-game when the population hits a certain height, and the game engine is still trying to calculate hundreds, if not thousands, of stats, pathfinding, and a lot more. I had to read deeply in A Tale of Two City Skylines 2 in researching these processors, and for even a tech nerd like myself, the processor lingo can be a bit overwhelming, especially when Intel has names like Eagle Lake and Cannon Lake, Amber Lake, Ice Lake, and of course 2017's Coffee Lake. But what exactly is an older processor? Take a look at this hierarchy graph that is in no way, shape, or form sponsored by Fruit Stripe Gum. In my readings, I found some popular previous processors that launched prior to our minimum specs. This is a very wide range of tech, so how would it be possible for a 12-year-old CPU to run City Skylines 2? The answer could be found with City Skylines 1. When City Skylines 1 came out in 2015, the Unity engine it was using relied heavily on single-core speed. City Skylines 2 appears to be a whole new ballgame, and Colossal Order has said that they will be using all the powers of multi-core processors. Of course, we won't know until we actually play the game, but at minimum, pardon the pun, CS2 will work better on a wider variety of processors than the first game did. But is this usage of multi-core processors presenting a false sense of hope for older CPU owners?
Oh, that's basically what it is.
Or is it? I did a lot of side-by-side comparisons between some of these perceived older chips, and I found in one example, the 10-year-old AMD FX 9590 versus the Ryzen 7 1700X, which is a step up from the minimum recommended CPU, was beaten in every single benchmark. The kicker here was the 9590 was still performing at a very high level, although it was being bottlenecked by an RTX 3080. Speaking of bottlenecking... And look, I know those games may not compare to the depth of calculations that City Skylines 2 will probably need, but there's hope that with the right settings adjustments and some help from a solid GPU and RAM, that your current CPU may just be enough to create the city of your dreams, or at least a small village. Now let's turn our attention to the highly debated graphic card recommendations. As you can see here, there is a much wider gap in overall power between the recommended and minimum requirements to run the game. But this isn't necessarily a bad thing. This means that a wider range of gamers will have a card that falls somewhere in this range. As according to my readings, 71% of PC gamers at least have the minimum card. The biggest difference in these stats of GPUs is something called CUDA cores, or as AMD calls them, stream processors, or as page 93 calls them, pipelines. Just like your CPU has multiple cores, a GPU has several hundreds to thousands of these mini cores, and they're responsible for processing all the data that is fed into and out of the GPU. These little graphical workhorses render scenery in game, geometry of character models, complex lighting details, shading, and much more. When researching these pipeline core counts, it's important to note that AMD and NVIDIA measure them differently, so the overall number of these pipelines can be somewhat misleading. Comparing GPUs is very challenging. If you want to compare, I suggest looking at real-world benchmarks found on YouTube and many other places scattered across the interweb. City simulators are a bit different than a normal video game. Unlike games that focus on maximizing frames per second or incredible details within a tight play area, city builders have multiple layers of simulation running concurrently and reliably all at once. This is something that is usually the responsibility of the CPU processor, but with City Skylines 2, the GPU will likely be more important because of all these rapid-fire calculations having to be displayed in a whole new level of detail. Speaking of details, the VRAM difference between minimum and recommended is quite large, but my hope is this will mostly matter with people that are trying to run a game in 4K resolution, and that older GPUs out there, as long as you turn down some graphical settings, would be able to handle the game at 1080p. Recently, a select amount of City Skylines content creators
Denied.
have been given early access to the new game, and since I'm not a big tea drinker, I chose to watch a channel called Move the Mouse, which I highly recommend. During his playthrough, Mr. Mouse brought up the in-game options menu and went to the graphics settings, which I was very excited to see. However, he had to turn all the graphics settings on medium. My curiosity led me to a link that showed me all of his specs. His setup exceeds all the recommended settings for City Skylines 2. This was a tough pill to swallow as he has a more powerful system than even myself, and I was also very jealous of this standing desk. But at the end of the day, he was getting good frame rate results and was able to play the game just fine. And as he noted, and I will as well, this is a beta version of the game. It's not the finished product, although we're getting very, very close, so you wouldn't think it would be too much different than what we're going to see on October 24th. I found this rather puzzling, and this opens up more questions like, will CS2 support DLSS, or Deep Learning Super Sampling, or what AMD calls Fidelity FX Super Resolution, or FSR. These technologies have become more common and help with frame rate results throughout a lot of different titles. And the good news is the Unity engine does support both of these functions. Based on my updated findings, I would say that most gamers with at least the minimum GPU should be able to play the game on low settings at 1080p, as long as the rest of the computer isn't holding you back. That should be obvious since after all, Colossal Order is the one determining those requirements. But regardless of that, lowering your resolution and graphics settings should help these older GPUs get the job done on this game. That being said, should you be chicken to try out your old video card on City Skylines 2? Allow me to take a bit of a U-turn. My analogy from literally 7 minutes ago can still be applied today. In April of 2002, SimCity 4 was announced, and me and my friends were really excited to see what it looked like. SimCity 2000 was this old gamer's first city builder, so needless to say I was really excited for the new game. And after this edition of GamePro, my enthusiasm was overwhelming. SimCity 4 was packed with new features, but most of all it promised 3D graphics instead of the flat look of the older SimCities. I knew my not-so-old Pentium 2 was in for a challenge as SimCity 4 required a Pentium 3 500MHz, and scariest of all, a video card. And I didn't even have an AGP slot. You see kids, there was a time when games didn't require a GPU at all. Some of them didn't even require Windows, and instead used Microsoft DOS. And you could buy a gallon of gas for under $1. But when that fateful day came in 2003, I bought it anyways. And to my surprise, I could run the game on the absolute lowest settings possible. And I was building cities, from what I could tell, in no time. In closing, my hope for you is your computer can vindicate my second generation Pentium, and the City Skylines 2 works well for you. And if you're someone who is running the minimum, you don't have to live a life of luxury for a small upgrade that will help you at least get somewhere in the middle. Whether it be your CPU, GPU, or RAM. Oh crap, I forgot to talk about RAM. You should have 16 gigabytes of RAM. I hope that your computer components work in harmony and that my videos have not led you into an intertwining paradox. Computer technology is ever evolving. It always seems like when you get the newest tech, newer, techier tech is just around the corner. Having older components is nothing to be ashamed of, and now more than ever, developers are focused on making games run on a wide range of PCs. And just remember, in the immortal words of hellllooo, look for the bare requirements, the simple bare requirements. Forget about your graphics and your chips. I mean the bare requirements with this old gamer's confidence. You'll have the bare requirements of life.
Amen.
Hey guys, I just wanted to say a big thank you to everybody for the amazing response to my first video. I really appreciate it. I was actually kind of done making videos on YouTube, and you guys kind of injected me with some newfound confidence. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.